conferences ago, I speak about diversity and plurality of religions and cultures, which during the time I said characterize our global modern society. And in that society, pluralism and dialogue are key frameworks in promoting peace and harmony in our modern world. But given the events leading to that conference, especially the question about the refugees and the migrants, I said there's a need to move beyond the attitude of pluralism and the dynamics of dialogue to hospitality and generosity. I said in that paper, the plurality and diversity encourages us to be open to others, especially to the uniqueness of our religious and cultural beliefs and traditions. Such openness leads us to the attitude of pluralism and the dynamics of dialogue, both religious and cultural. However, I also posited that in every human encounter, that encounter can be an encounter of hospitality, and in that moment, we do not only welcome the human person, we also welcome God, from whose image the human person was created. So continuing my reflection for this conference, I pose certain questions on the dialogue between the I and the other. How do we resist the temptation of absorbing the other into our own thought? Conversely, how do we avoid the opposite attitude of putting too much emphasis on the other to the point of minimizing ourselves just to accommodate the other? And another question, how can the duality of identity and alterity be harmonized? And how such notions can have more experiential significance in our human relations and encounters? So, the next part will be identity and alterity, the I-other duality. So I'll be proceeding through this overview, identity of the self, the alterity of the other, and the problematic of the identity-alterity dynamics. In human relations, the focus is always on the self and the other, and the respective identities that the self and the other bring to the interaction or relation. And while there may be a mutual recognition of the value and presence of the other, is always appears to the self as other. In other words, someone who is distinct and different. Now, at the core, therefore, of every human relation is the dynamics of identity and alterity. The human person as a self has his own identity in the other, even though he has his own respective identity, is always considered as different and distinct. Now, to be more specific, every human person has his own identity. Every one of us. We have our own self, our own ego, which sets us apart from others. Our personal identity is always based on, we have our own thoughts, our own intentions, wishes, desires, motives, needs, aspirations, dreams, etc., etc. Now, aside from this, of course, our personal identity is determined by our culture, by our tradition, and our social systems from where we are born. I'm a Filipino, so I'm defined by my Filipino roots. A person always carries with him his own belief systems and religious orientations. And it is the nature of the self to set itself apart from other selves. The ego is oriented toward building its own identity. And identity is premised on the fact that one is different from others. However, human existence is not an isolated existence. There is the presence of others, meaning the others, the alter ego, or the other selves. This brings us the notion of alterity, or otherness. Aside from the ego, which has its own identity, there are also other egos with their own respective identities. So, in a human encounter or relation, that person will have to be rooted first of all in his own culture and to be confident about his own beliefs, religions, practices, language, and even color. Now, and again, you will also have to address the other who also belongs to a different culture or a different religion and race, and whose subjectivity will be different from his own. And I think this conference is a concrete manifestation or illustration of that. Hence, me, for example, as a participant of this conference, must also be open and respect the diverse cultures and religions that I may encounter in this conference. In other words, I must respect the very alterity of the other. Now, therefore we can say that alterity and identity go hand in hand. The dynamics, however, of their relation is somewhat problematic. And the relations has been the subject of many speculations and reflections of various philosophers. Now, just a generalization, here are some. There are those who emphasize the uniqueness of every individual and put more value on the freedom and determination of the self. On the other hand, there are also those who put more emphasis on the very otherness of the other, putting more emphasis on alterity. And there is, of course, the question about how the self should regard the other, like, for example, in the case of a stranger whose foreignness is explicit, than that of a friend who may be other but is close to you. Some of the participants here are first time that you have met, that you will be meeting in this conference, so they appear to be foreign, but there are those participants you've been with for a longer time, and therefore they are closer to you. And of course, there's also the negative attitude of objectifying the other simply as an object, like any other material object in the world. Now, I will skip this part. This is where I actually talk about Wojtyła, Marcel, and Buber, but that's a long discussion. Let me just say that all philosophers of intersubjectivity, and that they have this common notion of people always being together with others. So I will skip that part, but in my complete paper I have a more detailed discussion on this. Because that's where I established the very the dynamics of this identity-alterity thing. Now let me go now to the main point actually that I'm trying to make in this presentation. So, to address the questions posed at the beginning of this presentation, I go now to my Filipino roots, the Filipino interpersonalism. And then I will be following this overview. I'll talk about the Filipino worldview, the Filipino notion of person or tao, that's not tao, but it's tao, and the notion of self or sarili. So, first, the Filipinos, like their Asian neighbors, have a holistic worldview. Okay? We do not make, or of course, we make categorizations, but we seldom make compartmentalizations of reality. There's always that idea of everything putting in just in one place. You know, the sacred and the profane just coming together, no distinction between whether that's sacred or profane or worldly. Okay? Because in his mind he can make these classifications. The world or reality is seen as a whole where everything, the physical, spiritual, and divine, is an integral part of reality. And even the self, or the sarili, is regarded not as a totally separate identity, but integral part of the world or of reality. Now, the Filipino believes that he is one with humanity and is connected with creation. He experiences himself as part of the world and acknowledges that the life space on earth is but one for all. The Filipino psyche is not keen on making distinction between subject and object. Even when we make our sentences, it's hardly you can distinguish between what is the subject and the predicate. Okay? There's a linguistic way of putting that in the Filipino. So our worldview, our psyche, is always non-dualistic. Hence, such distinction between self and other is somehow undermined in the Filipino mentality. Because if you're going to make a distinction between the self and the other, I can make the distinction. But in our day-to-day, affairs, we simply do not make that distinction. Okay. The Filipino does not only emphasize the inner core of the person in his value and his outer dimension. He also recognizes the relationality or relatedness of the person with other persons. Such view of the person may be different from the egoistic interpretation of the Western mind, where the ego or self is affirmed as a separate identity. And that's what actually I discussed in the first part of my presentation. That duality of the I and the other. The person for the Filipino is relational. It is always related to the other persons, to the community or society, to the world, and to the divine. The ego, or the sarili, for the Filipino cannot be detached from others. While the ego, or the sarili, has to be developed, it cannot be developed apart from others. Independence or autonomy, we call it pagsasarili or kasarinlan, or independence, may be a value, but when the ego or the self is completely detached, as in egoistic or selfish, now that detachment is regarded as negative. Somehow you can see some similarities between the Filipino and the Chinese, especially in matters of, in family matters. Because of personalism and interpersonalism, Filipinos attach great importance to social approval, acceptance, warmth, closeness of reciprocal ties, loyalty to persons and the family. They want their actions to be approved and accepted by others. And one of the most painful experiences for the Filipino is separation. Separation from the family, from friends, and from loved ones. Now you wonder what happens to these millions of Filipinos working abroad being separated from their families. It's very painful. But they are driven by economic reasons. Now, the Filipino notion of Kapwa. Okay. So, again, I'll be talking about 3 points. The Kapwa, o kapwa-tao, pakikipagkapwa, in the valley of pakikipagkapwa-tao. The person is a tao. Okay? And the other person is a kapwa-tao. Now, there's a very important prefix here, the ka. The ka symbolizes or means relational or connectivity. That's why we put ka almost in every word. There is kaibigan, kasama. See? It's a very important. So kapwa is a concept and value that combines the self and other. As a term, it is used to address another with the intention of establishing connection. If, for example, even in Filipino, brothers or sisters are called kapatid. Kapatid is to be broken or to be attached. So if you are siblings, you are attached to one another. Okay. The Filipino psyche recognizes that every human being connected to other human beings, and its individual, although unique, is an integral part of humanity. So, through the concept of the kapwa, we recognize that the essential humanity of everyone is connected and not separated from others. So the core value of the Filipino personhood is not just the person or the tao, but also the kapwa-tao. Kapwa-tao meaning shared identity or shared self, which opens the self or the person to the other self, to the kapwa-tao. Because you can still see the distinction between the self and the other, but in the notion of the kapwa, that distinction simply disappears. The self is not seen as a separate identity or an entity, but a related self to the other self. So the self, or the I, or the ego, or ako, includes the other. The other could be ikaw or siya. Remember, see the ka there in that word. Now, the closest English equivalent term of kapwa is other. But other in English connotes what is opposed to the self. And it implies the recognition that the other is a separate identity. The other is a separate identity. The Filipino term of other is as different is iba, which literally means different. So if you are not friends, you are iba. You are not kasama, you are not one with us. But we always take others as kapwa. Right? So the other person can be an iba, different, or other, or a kapwa. But a kapwa, on the other hand, recognizes a shared identity and an inner self shared with others. So, the social and political status of the other is not important. Whether you are rich or poor, it doesn't matter. Particular characteristics or state in life and society, they do not matter. A person starts having a kapwa, not so much because of the recognition status given him by others, but more so because of his awareness of shared identity. Once the I, meaning ako, starts thinking of himself as different from the kapwa, then the self, in effect, denies the status of kapwa of the other. The opposite of kapwa is iba, meaning is different, which means not just other, but totally other. Now, if the person is tao, and he has value, then the kapwa tao has an inherent value. If I have a dignity, then my kapwa tao has a dignity, because we have the same humanity. The notion of kapwa implies moral and normative aspects that oblige a person to treat one another as fellow human beings and therefore as equal. It bridges the deepest individual recesses of a person with anyone outside of himself, even the total strangers. Because of his pakikipagkapwa tao, that's the manifestation of kapwa. Okay? If I regard the other person as my kapwa, then that's pakikipagkapwa tao. That's being a kapwa. Okay? So, kapwa and pakikipagkapwa tao are not just notions or concepts for Filipinos. They are in fact values more than concepts, and therefore they are lived rather than thought of. They are practiced in day-to-day affairs. Okay, let me just go to my last point. The pakikipagkapwa-tao is the basis of our empathy. We empathize with other people because they are kapwa. It's also the basis of our deep sense of hospitality. We welcome even strangers because they are kapwa. Okay? It's also the basis of our camaraderie in close family relationships. It's also the basis of our deep sense of gratitude and reciprocity, because everybody is a kapwa. Now, for my concluding remarks. A dialogue of any kind, whether interpersonal, intercultural, or interreligious, and at any level, whether interpersonal or social, that strives to promote hospitality and generosity to the other must have some axiological basis. Identity and alterity must not remain on the level of rational discourse or on the level of epistemology, like some kind of terms that we need to define and make distinctions. It must be rooted in human experience and human values. Next point. The Filipino value of pakikipagkapwa-tao as a form of intersubjective relation arises when we recognize the other kapwa not just as somebody that is different and distinct, but as somebody whom we share our identity as human persons. Third point. Once we recognize the other as a kapwa, then it is easy to respect, to care, to be fair, and to love the other. Once we treat the other as a kapwa, then we can be generous and be hospitable to the other. Once we recognize the migrants, the refugees, the poor, the needy as kapwa, then it is easy to welcome and embrace them. Next point. Once we recognize that despite our differences in beliefs and diversity of our religions and cultures, we are all kapwa, and that we share a common identity as human beings, then we can come together in the spirit of harmony and peace. Next point. Pakikipagkapwa-tao may be a Filipino terminology, but it's not really distinctly and uniquely Filipino. For deep within the heart of every human person is that sense of shared identity with everyone. For in the end, we're all human beings, all striving to relate humanely and harmoniously with our fellow human beings. Another practice of the Filipino, alay kapwa. And I hope we can do this. It does not take to be a Filipino to do the alay kapwa. Alay means offering or gift. Hence, alay kapwa is an offering or a gift in the name of or for the sake of our kapwa. Respecting and helping others is an alay kapwa. Being hospitable and generous to others is an alay kapwa. Maraming salamat po. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, dear Professor Jove, for this philosophical presentation about the concept of Kapwa. Yes, I found it very interesting. Yes, and we will continue our debate with the Batadone because I want to have a discussion with you about the relation between the orthodox notion of person and the philosophical concept of Kapwa. If there are some questions, yes, please, Professor.
Sorry. Thank you, Jim, for your very brilliant presentation. And I was hearing you. I couldn't but compare with the very enlightening presentation of Professor Katarina. In a caricature, it seems there is a problem of self-centered persons in Slovakia and out-centered persons in the Philippines. But I have a question for you, which I think it's important. This approach of pakikipag kapwa in Filipino, is it a facilitator for religion, or, on the contrary, it's self-sufficient? If it comes from the deep roots of Filipino culture, is it self-sufficient, or does it facilitate religion? And I ask this because, as we see what happens in Philippines from the outside, we see the actions of President Duterte, who doesn't seem too much pakikipag kapwa.
Everything but pakikipag kapwa. Thank you very much. For the first question, it could be both. I mean, it could facilitate the practice of religion. In fact, the last concept that I mentioned about alay kapwa is a project of the church to encourage people, Filipinos, not necessarily Catholics, to do the alay kapwa. Okay. But there's a problem with the Filipino values, because Filipino values could somehow be ambivalent. You see, the value could be both positive and negative. People could take advantage of that notion of pakikipagkapwa. Take an advantage, for example, of a friend or a person who helps you. See? So it could be both positive and negative. That's why in my presentations, in my lectures, I'm always talking about setting, focusing on the positive value or the positive interpretation of this value. Just like, for example, pakikisama. Pakikisama is friendship. Friendship could be positive and negative. A good friend would help, but a bad person would use your friendship to take advantage of you. So you see the ambivalence of certain values, and I think it's for the people to realize that and to practice that. So I think it will depend on the value system of the person, how he utilizes or how he practices his value or his value system.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, Professor Morena, the last question, please.
Thank you very much for your presentation on the concept of Kapwa, which reminds us about Christian virtue of the love of the other like oneself. This conception of Kapwa is based also on a religious faith, or is it based only on a philosophical conception?
Thank you very much, ma'am. It's both. Actually, when you say Kapwa, it's not really Catholic. It's Filipino. It just so happened that the Filipinos were colonized by Spain, and then they baptized us into being Catholics. But the Filipino, ever since even before the coming of the Spaniards, already this value of Kapwa, pagkikipag Kapwa. So I think it was enhanced by religion, no? And that's a good thing. So it's the cultural and the religious working hand in hand to make this value really a more positive value. But of course, as I've said, some people could use this for different reasons.
Thank you.
Thank you.